Welcome, everybody, to the MCSS webinar, Stories of Solidarity and Change, Jewish Participation in Democratic Society. I'm your host, Dave Johnson, MCSS Board Secretary and Online Learning Committee Chair. We are glad you're here tonight, and in just a minute, I will be turning things over to our presenter for the evening, who is far more qualified to talk about what we're talking about tonight than I am. But first, we've got just a few quick housekeeping announcements here. Sketches are available for this session. I will be uploading them into MOEX this week. If you haven't received anything by the end of next week, please reach out to me directly and I will see what I can do to get that squared away. I am brand new as a sketch coordinator, but I am learning things quickly. Also, our president was contacted and wanted me to let you guys know that RAND, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization, is conducting a study to evaluate the impact of lessons about the Holocaust and other topics related to Jewish identity and history in middle and high school English language arts and social studies classrooms. So we are hoping to identify school districts in Michigan that would be interested in participating in the study. As you probably know, schools in Michigan are required to teach about the Holocaust, so we hope this project would be a good fit. The goal of the study is to understand how lessons build students' content knowledge on Jewish identity and history and the lessons' effectiveness in combating anti-Semitism. So there are more details about this project available on the website, and the QR code is there, and I will drop a link to the actual website in the chat as well, so that you have that if you are interested in potentially participating in that, going a little bit further. So different organizations, similar topics and themes. I would be remiss if I did not remind everyone that our annual conference is coming up in just over a month. If you've been wondering why we haven't said much about our keynote speakers, it's because we were waiting on final contracts for the second one. We are looking forward to welcoming teachers from all across the state to Traverse City for 2 days of exceptional learning, anchored by two incredible keynote speakers. We are proud to announce that on Friday at 3 p.m., we will have the one, the only Carl Azuz from The World from A to Z. And on Saturday, we have ABC senior political correspondent Rachel Scott. These two are both incredible speakers. We're lucky to have them both. We're lucky that they didn't say no and laugh our monetary offer out of the room. They're just both incredible people. So we're looking forward to welcoming them to the conference. They join an array of over 50 sessions dedicated to Dimensions 3 of the C3 framework, which is analyzing and using evidence, and of course, a healthy dose of media literacy. So you can register for that on our website at mcssmi.org. So you have a much more qualified presenter than me tonight, so I'm going to turn it over here in just a sec. But tonight, your presenter is Dan Osborne. He is the curriculum developer for Stories That Shaped a Nation, Jewish Lives in America. He is a history educator, education researcher, and nonprofit professional specializing in creating multimedia resources, humanities curriculum, and professional learning experiences like this one for educators. His background is in Middle Eastern and Jewish history, and he holds a doctorate in curriculum and instruction. He is the executive director of Project Mosaics, a nonprofit that weaves global and diverse Jewish voices into world history education. His work promotes a vision of education that is multicultural and globally oriented, and we are super pleased to welcome him tonight. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to turn things over to Dan. Take it away, sir.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that introduction and the opportunity to be here speaking with everybody tonight. I am going to go ahead and share my screen, and from there, we can get started. So thank you again, everybody. Dan Osborne. I'm representing the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History. And today we're going to be talking about stories of solidarity and civic change, looking at some examples from a curriculum that we've spent the last 2 years developing that is broader in scope, but was designed to hit upon multiple different dimensions of student civic learning. So that's what we're really going to be emphasizing with our time together tonight. I respect the fact that folks are muted or might have their cameras off, but for those of you who are open to sharing a little bit about what brings you here and what you're hoping to experience tonight, I'd love to just hear very quickly what motivated you to attend our webinar, and if any, what questions are you pondering as we go into this conversation? So, not to put pressure on Jennifer or Kristen, but if you are open to answering either of those questions, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, just excited to see what's in the curriculum and all the different components of that. So nothing too specific though. Yeah.
Amazing. I will happily be the one who takes over with regards to specificity tonight. Um, we will be looking at a slice of the curriculum. Again, we're focusing on the civic dimensions of it. It is a bit more expansive than that, but we'll see that unfold in just a short while. So, in the time that we have, I want to accomplish three big objectives. First, I just want to introduce everybody to the Weitzman Museum so that you all understand what we accomplish as an institution and how it is that we go about presenting to our diverse audiences of students, teachers, and the general public American Jewish history. I'm then going to share a little bit about the curriculum in question, Stories That Shaped a Nation, which for all of you is fully digital, it's online, it's free, there's no paywalls or barriers to accessing. And then speaking to the underlying theme of our webinar, we're going to be zooming in on certain lessons, activities, and resources from the curriculum that live at that intersection of teaching about Jewish history in the United States and also helping our students develop the skills, knowledge, and dispositions to be active and informed citizens in a pluralistic democratic society. So we'll be providing that introduction. We'll be introducing and modeling certain aspects of lessons that are focused on Jewish participation in democratic and civic life in the United States. And we're going to try to answer these two big guiding questions. How can teaching Jewish history foster students' understanding of civic participation and the struggle for justice and equality? And then also kind of getting a little metacognitive, stepping out and thinking about bringing this into our classrooms. What are the merits of incorporating Jewish voices and examples into the broader, more expansive study of democratic participation? So I want to start by sharing a little bit about the Weitzman National Museum of American Jewish History. And before I do, I'm just curious, Pamela, Kristen, Jennifer, Dave, have any of you had the opportunity to visit the museum in person? Are you familiar with it as an institution? You've been there in person, Kristen? Incredible.
Yes, I have been there. It's a great museum. Yeah.
Wonderful.
And I have not been there before.
Okay, well, we're always happy to have you. And Kristen, you'll be happy to know that we're currently renovating it. So the exhibits as they've existed historically are currently being reimagined. But even with that reimagining going on, the Weitzman is unique in that it is the largest institution in the United States dedicated to this particular form of studying Jewish life. Unlike many other museums that might be dedicated to the study of the Holocaust or other aspects of Jewish history or Jewish stories, the Weitzman looks at the experiences of diverse Jewish communities in the United States, looking at the way in which American Jewish history is woven into and complements and is deeply a part of the broader stories of aspirations, struggles, resilience, that happen in the United States. It is located in Philadelphia, across from Independence Mall. And we think that that location is not just happenstance, but it really speaks to the way in which Jewish people have been a part of communal and collective life in North America since the 17th century, well before the Declaration of Independence, well before the US Constitution. There's been a sustained Jewish presence in North America since the 1650s. So the location there at Independence Mall speaks to the longevity of American life or Jewish life in North America. The museum does a lot of different things, and I'm only going to highlight a few of the big themes that we explore in the narratives that we tell about American Jewish history, the ones that really pertain to civic life and the dimensions of this webinar. As we tell these stories of American Jewish life from the 19th century up through the 21st century. We focus on the ways in which Jewish people have in the United States actualized their ability to contribute to collective responsibility for the various communities in which they live. We tell stories of the struggle for ensuring and expanding human dignity for all, the role of Jewish people in social change movements, and in that search for social justice. And we also look at the ways in which the Jewish value of tikkun olam, repairing the world, is really a part of many of the different ethos that have animated Jewish contributions to civic life in the United States. All of this happens in the brick and mortar institution of the museum, in the various exhibits that we house there. And also, they've been channeled into stories that shaped a nation, the curriculum that we've spent the last 2 years really working on, and that we're really pleased to see being incorporated into classrooms around the country since its release earlier this school year in September of 2025. So I want to tell you just a little bit about the curriculum before I get into some of the thematic and conceptual pillars that uphold it, along with some of the pedagogical principles that are really consistently found across each of the lessons. And from there, we'll start looking at 3 different lesson examples that really speak to these questions of civic life and Jewish participation in democratic society. The lesson plans at this stage consist of 16 that, again, span that arc from Jewish arrival in the 17th century up through the 21st century. In these lesson plans, which are continuing to grow, and by the start of the next school year, we will have published 5 more to bring the total of current lesson plans over 20 for the start of the next school year. These lessons deal with a whole range of topics that help demystify Jewish people for students around the country, and also help demonstrate the ways in which Jewish people have actively, consistently contributed to life in the United States. The lessons start with these big questions about who are Jews, what is Jewish identity, what is the Jewish relationship to diasporic life and diasporic existence, what is Jewish diversity, how do we look at the different dimensions of Jewish cultural, religious, and other forms of diversity. And then from there, the lessons really get into these questions of the multiple waves of Jewish immigration into the United States over the course of U.S. history, get into various questions over the history of anti-Semitism in the United States and the implications of anti-Semitism for a democratic society. But we also really want to emphasize more than just those struggles. We also really want to demonstrate the joy and the vibrancy of Jewish peoplehood in the United States. So a lot of those different elements, those themes, are really emphasized across those lessons. We recognize that not all teachers have the time, the means, the inclination to teach this many lessons about Jewish people over the course of the school year. So we have no illusions that this is going to constitute a 3 or 4 week long unit in classrooms. We have developed each lesson to be its own self-contained entity that can be incorporated into the arc of a U.S. history school year. So that's why we'll see lessons that deal with colonial life, the American Revolution, the early Republic, the Progressive Era up through the 21st century, so that we have the opportunity to see consistent and repeated representation of Jewish people in our classrooms, as opposed to something that feels more like a carve-out that might be reserved for just one lesson or 1 week or 1 month of the year when there's a Heritage Month, for instance. And by having this sense of Jewish people consistently represented in the arc of a U.S. history classroom, the goal is to really ensure that teachers and students alike understand the value of weaving Jewish voices, perspectives, and experiences into the history of the United States as something that is fully a part of U.S. history and not something that feels like it's adjacent to or outside of the other narratives that we're already invested in telling in our US history classrooms. And as we've gone about constructing this curriculum and thinking about how we can bring it to classrooms in ways that really amplify the work that teachers are already doing, we've drawn from multiple different theories and different frameworks, trying to embed our understanding of Jewish history in the dimensions of multicultural education, culturally affirming pedagogy, and social and emotional approaches to teaching and learning, so that when we talk about Jewish people in the course of US history, we're helping teachers to really reinforce some of the questions, themes, and issues they're already focusing on with regards to identity, diversity, community, otherness, and humanity. Each of our lessons is going to have certain elements that I want to share right now before we start looking at some concrete examples. Each of the lessons is going to have windows and mirrors pedagogy, where we ask questions and have activities that invite students to think about who they are, to reflect upon their communities, their values, their environments, their struggles, their yearnings and aspirations, before we ever ask them to think about or look at Jewish history and encounter Jewish voices. We really want to ensure that students are able to make those connections between what they're wrestling with and some of the big questions and concepts that we're introducing in the history of Jewish life in America. We really want to underscore the diversity of Jewish people. We're really intentional about not showing Jews as monolithic, as essentialized in any way, as culturally static or petrified. We really want students to understand the racial, ethnic, linguistic, cultural, socioeconomic diversity within Jewish life, not just around the world, but in the United States as well. As you'll see a little bit tonight, we focus a lot on Jewish contributions to life in the United States in order to help students around the country really understand who Jews are in relationship to the political life, the cultural life, the social life that has come to define the United States. So often when we talk about Jewish people in our classrooms, it can come through the narrow scope of looking at anti-Semitism, persecution, oppression, displacement of Jewish people from some places in the resulting migration to the United States. Obviously, those are going to be addressed, but we also recognize the need to bring Jewish joy into the classroom so that students can see Jewish history as much more than as Jewish scholars like to say, lachrymose history, or something that is focused entirely on the history of features of life that are bleak and really disheartening. We really want to focus on the opportunities that Jewish people have had in the United States and how that's enabled cultural, joyous experiences. That said, we also have to complement the study of Jewish joy with, as we also say, the study of Jewish oi, the study of anti-Semitism and bigotry, but not just looking at the way in which Jewish people have been othered, but looking at the ways in which Jewish people have struggled against, have had resilience in the face of anti-Semitism, have demonstrated for students resistance in the face of the history of anti-Semitism. And as we're really going to lean into tonight, we don't just focus on anti-Semitism as a particular form of bigotry in the course of human events, but we really want students to also recognize that in the United States, there have been moments, there have been episodes and chapters of US history wherein Jewish people have involved themselves in social change movements as allies, acting in solidarity with other communities, seeking to expand their rights, their opportunities, and their freedoms. We also don't want this to simply be the study of the past. Each lesson is going to have some sort of activity or exercise that invites students to think about who they are as active participants in an American pluralistic democratic society. We really want students to see historical examples as, if not a template, at least a catalyst for wrestling with these questions of what are the concerns that they have? What are the tools at their disposal? How can they act in ways that address salient issues of today and do so in ways that can perhaps contribute to the welfare of others as well? So because tonight we're talking about civic education, and we're not just talking about the broader and more expansive landscape of American history and American Jewish involvement in that history, I want to just very quickly touch upon some of the civic knowledge, skills, and dispositions that we were really intentional about trying to incorporate into this curriculum, sometimes subtly, sometimes very overtly. But these are some of the principles that really informed and shaped our decisions as we were writing this and as we're thinking about what we want students to cultivate, practice, and foster throughout their exposure to the curriculum. We drew from the C3 framework, and we really wanted to emphasize how civics is not just understanding branches of government and federalism and the existence of institutions and far-off cities like Washington, D.C., where other people do the things that shape democracy. But we really wanted students to understand through these lessons that civics is it's the study of how people participate in governing their society. And we wanted students to understand the role of individuals and individuals who come together when they mobilize and they engage in collective action to enhance democratic society. In order to understand how individuals can constructively, meaningfully, and intentionally participate in democratic life, you have to have civic knowledge. And there is no short supply of different kind of concepts that are part of a broader ecosystem of students' civic knowledge bases. But what we really focused on is certain historical moments, episodes, and themes where we see groups contributing to U.S. history in ways that are part of struggles for freedom, equality, and justice, where we can showcase for students the way in which people form and then engage with social and political networks for the sake of making change. And we also recognize that many of the change movements that we're looking at are unresolved and are part of the persistent nature of some of the issues at the heart of American society. So we didn't want to showcase, or we didn't want to produce a sort of false narrative of injustices being entirely resolved or past tense, as though the struggle is not something that continues into the present. We want students to wrestle with the unresolved nature of some of the histories we're looking at. There's multiple intellectual skills in civic education, and the ones that we really focused on are helping students recognize the existence of multiple points of view, wrestle with them, and learn how to constructively interpret and critique different points of view, while also learning how to effectively formulate and articulate an opinion in the classroom. We really focus a lot on these skills of speaking and listening, reading and writing, and learning how to listen actively, attentively, and empathically in the classroom. And because we're also looking at these questions of how a more perfect union can be formed by recognizing the imperfections of the union, we want students to be able to, coming out of these lessons, identify different public problems that they can address in their own lives, in their own contemporary realities. Civics is also not just about the intellectual skills, the habits of mind that come out of the classroom, but also some of those participatory skills that enable students to be agents in the world and not only thinkers in the classroom. So as such, like I already indicated, we focus a lot on engaging in dialogue and helping students in a developmentally appropriate manner learn how to live with and navigate the existence of different, competing, and sometimes even divergent perspectives and opinions. And then also learn how to participate in groups perhaps how to arrive at consensus, how to negotiate across differences. These are the sorts of communication styles and exercises that we really want students to encounter through this history. So that way, we're not only focusing on the study of the Jewish past and present in America, but we're also helping students develop transferable skills that will take them far beyond this particular set of stories and voices that we're showcasing. The last thing is that we really want these lessons to help contribute to students' development of different civic dispositions, among which are respect for difference, respect for those who perhaps think, look, behave, pray, worship, and engage in the world differently than them. And we also want students to understand how other people are struggling with the absence of their rights or the incomplete nature of the rights that they have as they play out in the world. We want students to, if not themselves, develop an understanding of why in a civil society we are invested in the welfare of others, to at least encounter moments in history where people demonstrated concern for the welfare of others. And at the end of all of this, what we really wanted to do was to create learning experiences that not only expose students to history, not only help them see Jewish people in complex, multifaceted, and humane ways, we also want students to experience student-centered, inquiry-based learning opportunities where their agency, their voice, and their sense of empowerment as people who can contribute to democratic life is really honored and valued in the classroom. I'm going to pause here. That was my overview. That was my introduction. That was an attempt to kind of let you know what's behind the other side of the curtain. So often curriculum writers and organizations will say, here's our product, and we'll just kind of walk you through the procedures. I want you to know the thinking behind it. That's what I just spent some time doing. So I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions, comments, observations. Otherwise, we can start looking at some of the lessons themselves. All right. So while I said there's about 16 lessons that currently exist, we're writing 5 more this year, I only want to focus on 3, not in their totality, but in how they really directly illuminate some of what I just elaborated upon. I want us to start by looking at one lesson focused on the history of religious liberty and the struggles for religious liberty over the course of U.S. history. And then there's 2 lessons focusing on Jewish participation in the civil rights movement. One at a sort of macro level, looking at, quote, grass tops, or those who were some of the most visible leaders and contributors to the civil rights struggles of the 1950s and 1960s. And then I want us to turn in the next lesson to looking at some of those individuals who were wrestling with these questions at a more local level, and who perhaps in the arc of human events were lesser known or unknown in the 50s and 60s, but whose voices have been captured in hindsight by those who were looking to raise questions about what Jewish people did or didn't do or could have done differently. So this is where we're going to go in our time remaining. So we'll start with this first lesson, religious liberty in the United States. I'm going to walk us through some of the questions, the prompts and exercises that students would be exposed to. And then after I do that, a little explanation of what it would look or feel like for students to encounter this, I have some questions for all of you if you're open to breaking the silence and sharing some of your observations. So again, as I said, each lesson is going to have these windows and mirrors opportunities for students to engage in turn and talks, think, pair, shares, reflective writing, opportunities for kind of meaningful meditation on some of the bigger themes or issues before we look at the historical case studies. So, this first lesson on the history of religious liberty, we start with these big questions that we want students to ponder. Why do you think protecting religious expression is necessary? How do you think religious expression is protected? And then, in your own words, what is religious liberty? So, these questions, I've condensed them into one slide for the sake of our time together. But these really are scaffolded to help students think about just why does this right or this protection even exist? What are the mechanisms through which it's protected? How do we guarantee and protect a given right? And then how do we even define this thing rather than using the terminology without a necessarily grounded understanding of what it consists of? The lesson continues after students have the opportunity to engage in that reflection and to engage in that kind of self-directed understanding of the big themes before they've latched on to any of the content or the kind of historical evidence to help them get more of a depth to their answers. We introduce these definitions of religious liberty, and then we show them the text of the First Amendment in order to help them understand one of the central vehicles through which religious liberty is protected in the United States through our constitutional system. However, we then bring the story back to a time before the First Amendment existed, a time where perhaps there was more ambiguity, uncertainty, and less of a sense of security that in North America there would be religious liberty, and that Jewish people and many other religious minority communities would have a sense of religious autonomy and freedom to practice. We bring the conversation back to the arrival of the earliest Jews in North America, those Jews who were descendant of Sephardic Jews from Spain, who themselves were displaced from the Iberian Peninsula through a process of exiling those who did not convert to Catholicism, a process that also resulted in the mass displacement of Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula as well. The first Jews who arrived in the United States actually came from the colony of Brazil after it was lost by the Dutch to the Portuguese. And the same sort of fear of persecution and reality of persecution that had driven Jews out of the Iberian Peninsula also drove them out of Brazil and into the British colonies of North America and the Dutch colonies of North America. After students have that understanding that it was the search for religious tolerance and religious freedom that brought Jews to North America in the first place, we then, in the course of this lesson, will bring them to a particular moment after the American Revolution was waged, prior to the ratification of the US Constitution, when Jews and all Americans are on the precipice of creating this new political system, and where Jews in Newport, Rhode Island had as we like to say, the chutzpah, the audacity, the moxie to write to George Washington and inquire, what is our status here? So I want to read excerpts from these letters that were written by representatives of the Jewish community in Newport, Rhode Island in 1790, and also the response that members of that community received from George Washington. So Moses Sykes, he wrote, "Sir, permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you with the most cordial affection and esteem for your person and merits, and to join with our fellow citizens in welcoming you to Newport. Deprived as we heretofore have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty, disposer of all events, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship, deeming everyone of whatever nation, tongue, or language equal parts of the great governmental machine. To this letter, George Washington responds a few days later, quote, "Gentlemen, it is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the good will of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." These letters are a bit of a challenge to work through. It takes time to make meaning of them in the classroom. I'm going at a much swifter pace tonight for our sake than we would with students. However, we want students to engage in a process of close reading, of critical reading analysis. So we have them read these letters more than once. In the first reading, we ask them to explicitly try to identify sentences or phrases in either letter from the Newport community or the response from Washington that have to do with religious liberty in the newly established United States. After they've done that, we want them to go back and read it again with certain questions in mind. What is the Jewish community's hope for this new government? What is George Washington's promise of the new government? What's the difference between religious toleration and religious liberty? This is not directly answered in the letter exchange. Washington does invoke the term tolerance or toleration, so there's some implicit understanding of this, but this is asking students to go a little bit deeper and try to make their own interpretation based off of some evidence, but not necessarily an answer that's ready-made for them. How is a tolerant society different from a free society? And then, because this lesson could have simply been about the incredible promise and reality of religious freedom that was bestowed upon Jews in the United States, as if that was the panacea that solved all the world's problems in this new country, we don't want to give that false impression. So we ask students to critically read against the grain and wonder who was not protected by this promise. What rights are not guaranteed in this letter exchange? Why does it matter? And in this, we're asking students to draw upon their prior knowledge, to make connections to their understanding of the history of racial inequality, gender inequality, class inequality, other inequalities in the United States. So that way they're recognizing that even in this moment, we're a Jewish community that had been pushed out of Spain, that had been pushed out of South America, that was hoping that in this new republic, they would find for once a government that would allow them to practice freely and openly without concern for the government's involvement in their expulsion or oppression. Even as students are reading that letter exchange that is steeped in this affirmation of this Jewish yearning, we're still asking them to recognize the somewhat limited parameters of rights bestowed upon a vulnerable and concerned minority. And the fact that outside of those parameters, there are still other minorities, other vulnerable communities who are not having their rights expanded or guaranteed in this moment. There's more to this lesson, but I want to pause for a moment and ask you, as you're hearing me go through this overview and talk you through some of the lesson components, what civic knowledge are you seeing as being cultivated through this resource so far? This is one of those questions I'll allow folks to continue to ponder and reflect upon. So the lesson does not stop with Washington's letter to the Jewish community of Newport. The lesson actually continues by looking at and asking students to critically interrogate the ways in which religious liberty have not necessarily always been realized or actualized over the course of U.S. history. Yes, we have this seemingly revolutionary and uplifting letter exchange that reassures the Jews of Newport. We also then, in turn, have the First Amendment. However, that does not mean that there is an end to religiously motivated animus in the United States. And we want students to understand and wrestle with that question. Has that promise been a consistent reality? So over the course of this lesson, students will engage in close readings of multiple other examples, not only focused on the Jewish community. So we have some examples that are focused on the Jewish community. For instance, we'll have students read a portion of the Constitution of the state of Maryland from 1776, in which it declared that no test or qualification is required to hold office other than an oath of support to this state and a declaration of a belief in the Christian religion, essentially negating the First Amendment, or essentially interfering with the ability of the First Amendment to allow Jews in Maryland in the early years of the Republic to be office holders. This was a part of the Maryland Constitution for 50 years. There is not an act to repeal this until 1826. So we want students to recognize that simply because of the existence of the First Amendment, simply because of Washington's promise to the Jews of Newport, we still see these instances and these legal documents that are attempting to interfere with Jewish civil rights in the United States, Jewish religious freedoms in the United States. We also recognize Jews aren't the only community that has been on the receiving end of such interference with their religious liberty. One of the other examples that students, whether it be in a stations exercise or in a jigsaw exercise, we kind of leave that to the discretion of the teachers. They'll also look at 19th century examples of anti-Catholic animus and the way in which in civil society there were organizations, fraternities, and groups that were founded with an explicitly anti-Catholic intent to them that prohibited Catholics from joining and who sought to protect their perceived sense of the Protestant orientation of the United States by denying and depriving Catholics of the right to hold office or run for office. We bring this into the 20th century with the speech made by John F. Kennedy in 1960 when he was a presidential candidate, attempting to reassure the American public that as an individual who was raised Catholic, his politics would not be beholden to that of the Pope. He was attempting, nearly a century after that previous example, to assuage Americans of the concern that he would simply be a puppet of the Catholic Church. So we want students to see the repeated nature of these attempts to push beyond religiously motivated animus and biases in the United States, and the way in which they have permeated the fabric of our society in ways that have affected more than just Jewish communities. This lesson also includes a more contemporary example from the 21st century of a Muslim law enforcement officer in the United States. And I want to show a clip I want to show the video clip from the lesson that we have students watch as they are attempting to understand how these 18th, 19th, and mid-20th century examples that we've given so far also pertain to life for other communities in the 21st century, for instance, Muslims in the United States. So I want you to see this clip from the lesson.
Ayash has quite the story to tell.
My religion is a catalyst to who I am today. It has created an identity of compassion and kindness and respect, and allowed me to be who I am, and that's the authentic self that I am.
The 31-year-old is the eldest daughter of 5, born to Palestinian immigrants who came to the United States in the early 1980s. Ayash, starting a trucking business in Elgin, pursuing the American dream for his children.
He's such a hard worker, and he's so passionate about providing us a foundation to be successful. And him and my mother never had that opportunity.
We are proud of my daughter. She is a strong girl since she born.
From a young age, Maha was a star student, and her parents told her to shoot for the moon.
Follow her dream.
In October 2020, Ayash joined the Bartlett Police Department, where she works on patrol.
Hello, sir. The reason I stopped you is you forgot to use your signal turning left. It's an unspoken fear. I used to tell myself, me be a police officer? A woman that wears a hijab? Probably not.
It's something she had never seen before, but a conversation with a former mentor inspired her.
She said, "Ma, then break that. Then break that stereotype. Break that image that maybe just because they haven't seen it before, that you can't be the one to begin. I am the first one." Yes. And that's where I was able to see that, oh my God, there are barriers. Absolutely. But I found the voice and I found the story to push past that.
Ayash is now the first Muslim female police officer in Illinois to wear the hijab or headscarf on duty. The department having to update its standards of appearance to include the hijab as part of her uniform. During the Illinois State Police Training Academy, she also pushed to be allowed to wear sleeves under her polo t-shirt.
I could do everything. It just required some sort of modesty and accommodation.
She does an excellent job of being able to break down barriers. She's just a positive role model, especially for women and young children. And she just, because of her background and just how personable she has this uncanny ability just to connect with our community.
She's keeping the peace while keeping her faith.
You can break barriers. You can achieve the goals that your faith has set out for you. You can achieve your personal and your professional goals, and there's no need to compromise one or the other.
Stripping away stereotypes, hoping her story will help us all understand what we've never seen a little better.
I didn't have to change who I was and who I am. Why has it taken this long? And I don't really have an answer for that, but I'm glad that I had the courage to take that step forward, and hopefully an opportunity for women to see that. And the opportunity gave me a voice, and the voice gave me a story. And here I am.
So I hope that in seeing this example, you recognize the way in which this curriculum in this particular lesson introduces the idea of religious liberty and the ongoing struggle for it in ways that maybe begin with, but aren't limited to and don't end with the Jewish community. And as an institution, we've thought it was really important and invaluable to students to hear from a Palestinian Muslim woman who advocated for change in her local law enforcement's dress code so that she could practice her faith openly, proudly, and also participate in civic life as a law enforcement officer openly and proudly. So we end this lesson by having students engage in this conversation with one another where they're trying to answer these big questions of, has the promise of religious liberty been upheld through U.S. history? What can strengthen or weaken religious liberty in a democratic society? At this point, they're making informed statements based on the historical examples they've seen with the expansion, the contraction, and the anxieties of religious liberty that have played out over the course of U.S. history. So again, I'm going to continue to pose these questions more rhetorically. Hopefully you're seeing as educators that resources like the ones that we've shown you, the close reading exercise with the Jews of Newport and George Washington, with the film featuring Palestinian Muslim American woman who advocated for a change in her law enforcement agency's dress code so that she could openly practice her faith. These examples of anti-Catholic animus. Hopefully you're seeing that these resources offer students an appreciation for the struggles that are part of civic life and the ways in which people advocate for themselves through writing, through simply being present at the police academy and demanding that the police academy accept you on your own terms, that these are examples of what it means to constructively contribute to democratic society. I now want to continue moving forward with the first of the two lessons focused on the civil rights movement. Again, this one having a lot of orientation towards the more kind of macro level narrative and some of the more historically known or visible individuals. So the lesson starts with a series of prompts that, again, we give to teachers discretion for whether or not they want students to do this in a turn and talk, a whole class conversation, small group conversation. We have a series of prompts that are each kind of scaffolded to help students work through these questions of involvement in social change and involvement as allies or people in solidarity with others. We start with these questions of whether or not students know anybody who's attended a protest or a demonstration, not putting the responsibility on them initially, but just seeing if there's anybody in their orbit who has taken this sort of action. We then ask students directly if they themselves have ever attended or participated in a protest or demonstration, why they've attended, why they did that. From there, we move away from the direct question, has anybody you known attended a protest? Have you done it? And we introduce the language around allyship and solidarity, giving them a lens through which to think about people who act on behalf of the welfare of others. We ask them, again, another round of questions. Do you know somebody who has supported a community that they aren't a part of in an act of solidarity? We ask students if they themselves have done this and why they did this. Again, allowing them to ground this lesson in history, in the here and now, in themselves, their communities, the people that they know. And then we want them to kind of step back a little bit and just reflect on whether or not they think activism can change the world. Why or why not? We want students to surface and unearth some of their sensibilities, some of their assumptions about various ways in which people attempt to involve themselves in social change movements. From there, we want to begin the process of orienting students towards the study of the civil rights movement. Again, not telling the whole story of the civil rights movement, but telling that particular story of allyship and solidarity. So we want students, we hope that by the time students are encountering this lesson, they will have some prior knowledge about the civil rights movement. So we have some questions that are dedicated to helping them explore, unpack, and articulate some of their associations with not just the history of the civil rights movement writ large, but about particular moments, such as the 1963 March on Washington. After we've had students share what they know about it or what they've heard about it, we then introduce them to this primary source, this flyer, this pamphlet from the March on Washington, coffee stained and all. And we want them to do a close reading of it. There's so many reasons why we introduce students to primary sources, but it's not just to identify who the source is, when it was published, and whether or not it's reliable. We want students to read in order to seek out certain information, the way historians do. Historians don't just look at text to say, who is the source and are they trustworthy? They look at text to answer certain questions. So we give them this document from the March on Washington from 1963 and ask them to locate evidence of allyship and solidarity in it. And one of the things that we've noticed as teachers and students have looked over this text is that they see repeatedly that there are rabbis whose names are found on the program, rabbis who spoke before and after Dr. King, rabbis who signed on to the demands of the March on Washington. And hopefully once students identify that and it raises questions about who these rabbis were and why they would have been in attendance, we ask them to start thinking about what could have compelled these rabbis to speak at the March on Washington. We want to make a connection between the value systems that rabbis have at their disposal and also the rationale for being an ally in solidarity with another community. And if students are unfamiliar with Jewish value systems or some of the perhaps religiously motivated principles that these rabbis were bringing to bear, we introduce them to one short statement from the Talmud, from Jewish text. This text in particular is about Jewish ethics. The statement is, "It is not on you to finish the task, but neither are you free to desist from it." We have students then think, why would this statement about maybe not finishing the task, but also having to be compelled to contribute to it, how could this have inspired Jewish participation in the civil rights movement? And then from there, it's not enough to just look at the program, see that there are rabbis who attended and spoke, know that perhaps Jewish teachings and Jewish ethics compelled them to be there. We also want them to hear the voices of individuals who attended the march, who spoke alongside Dr. King. Too often, the March on Washington is distilled down to one statement about having a dream without any speeches being heard in their totality, without any other voices being present. So I'm going to show a short clip from one of the rabbis who spoke on that day in 1963, Rabbi Prince. And I want you to just listen and think, what does he claim are the concerns of American Jews? Why do the Jewish teachings about neighbors and dignity compel this particular rabbi to participate in the civil rights movement? What is it about the Jewish ancient and modern histories that promote solidarity between Jews and African Americans in this moment? And then also, what is it that Rabbi Prince is saying about the problem of being silent, of being an onlooker in the course of freedom struggles? I'm going to show this because I think his voice is powerful and it's worthwhile for us today to listen to him and for our students as well. And he's going to answer these questions in his own way.
I wish I could sing. I speak to you as an American Jew. As Americans, we share the profound concern of millions of people about the shame and disgrace of inequality and injustice, which makes a mockery of the great American idea. As Jews, we bring to the great demonstrations in which thousands of us proudly participate a twofold experience, one of the spirit and one of our history. In the realm of the spirit, our fathers taught us thousands of years ago that when God created man, he created him as everybody's neighbor. Neighbor is not a geographic term. It is a moral concept. It means our collective responsibility for the preservation of man's dignity and integrity. From our Jewish historic experience of 3,500 years, we say, our ancient history began with slavery and the yearning for freedom. During the Middle Ages, my people lived for 1,000 years in the ghettos of Europe. Our modern history begins with a proclamation of emancipation. It is for these reasons that it is not merely sympathy and compassion for the Black people of America that motivates us. It is, above all, and beyond all such sympathies and emotions, a sense of complete identification and solidarity born of our own painful historic experience.
So I only want to listen to a clip for the sake of our time together tonight. But I think in hearing from the first portion of the speech by Rabbi Prince, we are already understanding what motivates somebody to act in solidarity. How he's attending this monumental day, not as somebody who happens to be Jewish, who's also involved in the civil rights struggle, but somebody who, because of his Jewishness, is demonstrating that that is what motivates and fuels him to participate. The history of Jewish suffering, the history of Jewish marginalization, and also the moral teachings of Judaism, which declare that it is his responsibility to have concern for the welfare of the neighbor. So in the lesson, we not only have students listen to this, we also have the transcript of the speech so students can read and annotate. But we really think it's powerful that they understand, what does it look like when somebody is communicating effectively, persuasively, empathically, as an ally? What does it mean for you to see that demonstrated, particularly as a student in the 21st century, where communication styles maybe are a little bit different in the age of Instagram and TikTok and viral videos and political discourse that can often be divisive. There's a certain template here that maybe students won't emulate, but at least they'll have at their disposal as a reference point as they think, how do I communicate my ideas? How do I share with others why I care? I'm thinking about the work of Danielle Allen at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education and the Democratic Knowledge Project, in which Danielle Allen and the work of the Democratic Knowledge Project asks students in civics classrooms to answer these questions. Why do I care about this issue? What am I willing to invest in my concern for this issue? What am I willing to sacrifice? How do I make my involvement more than just about me and my ego? How do I make it about the welfare of others? And those questions are not necessarily the ones that we verbatim embed in the lesson, but it's the spirit of those questions that we hope students can continue to wrestle with as they hear this and other voices in the lesson. We also, in the course of this lesson, introduce students to one of the most prominent Jewish participants in the civil rights movement, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who famously marched with Dr. King in Selma in 1965. And as we introduce both Rabbis Prince and Rabbi Heschel, we recognize that we're telling a particular narrative, and we're self-aware of the fact that this narrative is being taught to students in the first portion of this lesson. So we ask students to pause and think, what is the story of Jewish and Black relations during the civil rights movement that emerges by studying these two rabbis? We want students to understand that they've already seen two prominent examples of individuals who are saying, as Jews, we care, as Jews, we march, as Jews, we protest with and alongside you, and that could be the whole narrative. We could perhaps stop it there, but we continue by having students read an excerpt from a letter, an anonymous letter published by a Jew who's sharing their view on segregation. This is a letter published in the early 1960s by an anonymous Southern Jew who was attempting to rebut some of the efforts made by the leaders of the Jewish community, such as Rabbis Prince and Heschel, who you just saw and heard from. And we're not going to take the time to read through this letter, but the excerpt from it is something that students will engage with in order to complicate their understanding of Jewish opinions and Jewish kind of the frictions that emerged within the Jewish community during the civil rights movement. And in this letter, students will encounter an individual who is defending the realities of segregation and who is arguing that it would work against his interests in order to desegregate society. So we want students to see that voice as well and to have that complicate their understanding so that this curriculum does not present a sanitized sort of Pollyanna-ish view on the civil rights movement and Jewish involvement in it. So we want students to really explicitly talk about in class how the story has been complicated through the addition of that third source in the classroom. So as we're doing that work of introducing students to historical examples of civic participation, as we're having them do that historical work of encountering and critically reading primary sources, we also recognize that the sources that we curate, the ones that we emphasize or de-emphasize, can shape and skew students' understanding of the past, and that we're really intentional about each source and helping them to see Jewish life in America in terms that are really nuanced and sometimes difficult to confront, to be honest. So we also end this exercise by having students return back to the present, to the here and now, and engage in an ongoing dialogue with their classmates about what communities they see fighting for their rights in their community, not focusing on the macro stories of the United States, but where they're located in their immediate environment. And then have them think about the types of civic action that appeal to them and what they could do if they were to act as an ally, to think about what motivates them as allies, and to think about the skills that they would need in order to effectively work as an ally, promoting solidarity for a community fighting for their rights. I'm going to pause, see if there's any thoughts, comments, questions. If not, I'm going to continue on to the next lesson and continue sharing a little bit about how we try to have even more kind of depth and dimension in the teaching of the Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement as it serves the interest of helping students think about what it means to live in and contribute to constructively or otherwise a democratic society. So we have students do this barometer exercise where they're thinking about the pace of social change as it addresses inequality, whether they think that we should have rapid change in society or more gradual change, allowing them to think about not just whether or not there is change, but how swiftly it comes and whether or not there's disruptions or whether or not the disruptions be damned, the change needs to happen. We then kind of introduce this framework for what students can or should think about as they both imagine themselves as participating in change, be it rapid or gradual, and encounter those from the past who participated in change, be it through an advocacy for more gradual incrementalism or more kind of radical immediate change. We want them to think about the different roles that people play. Not everybody is speaking in Washington, D.C. Not everybody has the microphone in front of them. Some people are seemingly invisible or behind the scenes or are taking other roles and being responsible for change in other ways. We want them to think about roles and responsibilities and the different capacities that one can involve themselves in, We also want them to, again, continue thinking about the value systems at play, what motivates people to engage in social change. And also, what are the risks? What is at stake? What might be sacrificed by participating in change, be it gradual or more rapid? The study of the civil rights movement is in many respects the study of people who knowingly made themselves vulnerable. We want students, as they're imagining themselves as future actors or current actors in social change, to really confront their vulnerabilities or the things that they might be risking as they engage in change. I want to show a clip from a short documentary film called In Solidarity, which moves the story of Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement away from that national level with prominent figures and situates it in one particular community and tells the stories of individuals who perhaps would otherwise not have their stories known had it not been for this documentary. Again, we want students to think about macro and more kind of local grassroots, quote, bottom-up history. And this video is going to make comparisons between anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism. And we want students to think about when or whether those comparisons are appropriate.
You will not replace us. 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 Communist round. White lives matter. White lives matter. White lives matter.
What's important to realize is that the targeting of Blacks and Jews together that you saw, for example, at Charlottesville with marching and with slogans is part of a longer story of bringing Blacks and Jews together, both as activists, comrades in arms, but also as targets of right-wing fury. So anti-Semitism and racism work together because they scapegoat.
Well, it is an interesting story because the Jewish community in Birmingham was here at the beginnings of this city. And so when this happened, it was based on hatred simply. But again, the hatred is based on fear. And the fear has its roots in displacement. But that is exactly what they fear, is being replaced. And there are, they believe in the conspiracy theories that have been around since ancient times that Jews secretly control everything. In fact, the civil rights movement was termed a Jewish communist conspiracy. And so in April of 1958, when this synagogue was attacked, it was one of several throughout the Southeast.
In 1960, CBS came to Sanford. I was a senior there. And they asked the question, what do you think about integration? And they had open mics, and one student after another got up to the mic and said, we've done things like this all our lives. You can't expect us to change overnight. And I got up and said,
I think that part of the problem is the conflict between what we ought to do and what we want to do. In principle, I am definitely against segregation, but yet, as far as principles, I feel that I, as a white person, am responsible for their conditions by keeping them economically low and keeping their educational standards down. So I feel that laws are necessary to make me do what I ought to do, even though I don't want to right now.
And afterwards, people came up to me and said, where are you from? And I said, North Carolina. And they said, oh, we knew you weren't from the South. As a Jew, I always felt like, we were told you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You have to treat others with respect, and that we're all created in the image of God, that every human life is important. So I've always felt like I should work for civil rights. But only recently did I realize that the things I did in the past were done without really understanding the other. I grew up in a white world and didn't really know what it took to be an advocate. And if you want the honest truth, I got involved with this committee to make sure it was telling the truth about what we did in the 60s, because I don't think we did enough.
A mystical concept. It comes from Kabbalah, or Jewish mysticism, and it means to repair the world. My view of Tikkun Olam is that we live in a broken world, and we've lived in a broken world since pretty much the beginning. What our responsibility is to build the world that God wants us to build. Part of that is the pursuit of justice.
You will not replace us. You will not.
So I hope in seeing that film, you're recognizing that there's a lot of different kind of elements at play here that relate to civic life. These questions of whether or not people did enough, whether or not people risked enough, or used the right tools, or went far enough, or acted quickly enough in the efforts to act in solidarity with another community. You're also seeing these questions of memory. The story told by Suzanne about wanting to be working on a civil rights memory commission at her synagogue so that it would tell a critical story and not tell an easy story or a heroic, uplifting story that perhaps glossed over some of the incompleteness or inadequacies of what she felt she or her peers did in that congregation decades previously. We also see the rabbi at the very end invoking the concept of Tikkun Olam, this mystical concept that means to repair the world, something that I said earlier is part of the sorts of lenses through which the Weitzman Museum looks at the way Jewish people in America have at times involved themselves in American history. Having students explore that concept, again, creates this opportunity to think about value systems, motivations, and identities as people start to participate in social change movements. And with that in mind, these lessons and these activities about Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement culminate with this writing exercise where students are imagining themselves 10 years in the future. They're asked to write a letter to themselves 10 years later and to give their future self advice for how to be an agent of change in the world, to be an agent of change who understands the different roles and responsibilities that they could play in social change, and who appreciates the risks that could come from participating in social change and the values that perhaps that person should hold on to in the future as they think about the change that they want to be in the world. So again, we're having students practice letter writing, practice communication, returning to those concepts of roles, responsibilities, risks, and values, and render that understanding in a meaningful way as they just heard from somebody who's thinking about what they did and didn't do and what they could have done differently. And we're giving students an opportunity to imagine their future selves, to avoid that kind of doubt or the kind of regrets that we saw Suzanne mentioning in her reflections on who she was during the civil rights movement. So this is what I have to share today. These are 3 different lessons, and this is my attempt to share with you how in them we have opportunities to work through certain skills, dispositions, and knowledge bases to help students prepare for active and meaningful constructive contributions to democratic life. These are what I chose to highlight today because I think the histories and episodes in question are really directly relevant for some of the content that's often taught in a U.S. history class or in a civics class. That said, I could have chosen from any number of lessons, but we didn't have 6 hours at our disposal, and I didn't want to keep you any longer than I already have. So I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Dave. I want to thank the Michigan Council for the Social Studies for affording me and the Weitzman Museum this opportunity to share some of our work. And I look forward to learning what it looks like when brought into classrooms throughout Michigan. Yes.
There we go. Okay. Well, thank you very much for doing this for us tonight. A 6-hour in-person training is good, but not so much via Zoom. So I think this was a really good length, but really appreciate you coming tonight. I will share that link out via email when I send the recap out, and just really appreciate you doing this for us. So thank you and have a great night, everybody.
All right, be well.